Okay, let's continue here with this series. This might be a fairly short video, but I want to get this out to you. I want to talk to you about what I call lensless thinking here. Um, so this is going, everything we're talking about in this shift, right? And this is another angle on it, is giving you an ability. We can call it a meta ability or an ability that other people don't use. They theoretically have it, but they don't use it. So we're going to want to spread it to other people, but it will also give us a great advantage if we want to think in that way. It'll also give you an advantage instead of thinking of it as an advantage over other people. It just gives you an advantage to have better outcomes and really have inevitable success in life. It doesn't mean you can do everything, right? It doesn't give you like immediate power even over your own mind in total, but it gives you this inevitable, inexorable power over your own mind, over good outcomes in general, over success in general. So I have here on this slide the idea, a mental picture of raw lumber versus planks. And of course, I have the word, the phrase lensless thinking. So I've shared in the past how there were two ideas, like in the 90s, as I started learning, things, and there are two popular success books or teachers, right? One was Tony Robbins, another was Stephen Covey with his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And between the two of them, right, Stephen Covey talked about perspectives and what was his word? I don't know if it was paradigm. I think he talked about principles, but Tony Robbins talked about. He said, well, there's one particular thing he said, which is if you want to live an extraordinary life, learn to think for yourself, including about what I say, is like a quote from him. And it's not that like both of them helped me in my 20s, right? I feel like I've discovered things at this point past what they've talked about, and that I'm not echoing just what they talked about. But the two of them together with just those pieces got me thinking that, hey, wait a second. Oh, and Stephen Covey in 7 Habits, he almost certainly, if my memory isn't totally playing tricks on me, used this idea of like the lenses, that like specifically the idea of a lens. But I thought, listen, how could it be that we can think for ourselves if we're using a lens? It occurred to me that to actually think for ourselves fundamentally, we would have to get beneath lenses, right? Um, Another way to think of it is there's this potential, but not actual, but potential infinite regress when it comes to, if we try to think, well, where's our free will, right? When I was thinking about doing this video, I thought about, I'm not like a particularly large Star Trek fan, but there's this idea that kind of helps illustrate what I'm talking about with Data, who was like an android, right? And they would explore this idea of, did he have free will, and he couldn't maybe go past his prime directive, which had something to do with not hurting people. Okay, um, so if we think about that, it doesn't matter if you've seen the show or not. But if you think about like a robot and it seems like it's sort of sentient, or we have AI these days, and people are confused about AI and how it relates to consciousness. They might not think they're confused, but they're definitely confused about that. But if we think about, you're an android and you can't go past your prime directive, right? Or that like any kind of computer program or AI, it can't really get outside of its most fundamental programming, we could say. But let's ask the question. Suppose you're this android, Data in the Star Trek show, is his name, and suppose you did have free will, right? Um, then the idea that they had would be, well, then you could theoretically go against your prime directive of, let's say, not hurting people. But then what's the next problem you would run into? Well, if you think about it, suppose you're this android and you're not bound by this idea of not hurting people. But then how do you then decide whether or not to do something that might involve hurting somebody, right? A person. And then you might think, well, maybe in self-defense, or if there's something you really want and the person's in your way. But so if you think about it, you are basically just have some other whim that your mind is going to give you, right? Some other desire or urge or conclusion. And then you're somehow having to decide whether to go with that conclusion or not. And then what do you use to decide whether to go with that new supposed free will that you have, or new choice that you have? How do you choose between going with that new choice or ability or freedom to potentially hurt a person, a human, versus not? And so you would get into this sort of infinite regress. And in reality, in practice, in the history of people thinking about this sort of thing, they tend to basically just give up somewhere before or at that point and sort of shrug their shoulders or kind of come up with some sort of cop out of an answer. And I won't try to get into what those might be. Mostly they just kind of stop there one way or the other. But there is an answer. And as I've said in various ways in the past, a key to the answer is to respect a sort of foothold or something that you can know, or some sort of crack in the wall or light shining through, no matter how seemingly small. On the other hand, in my opinion, in essence, or my experience, I would say, what kills people in turn, not actually kill them, but metaphorically, what messes people up with addressing this question and finding the right solution to, like, what is our free will in light of the fact that how do we actually not make assumptions in some way? You write some form of how do I not make assumptions? How do I avoid this infinite regress of potentially making decisions or using my free will? The problem that blocks people is they want too much at once. And there's been some form of this in a useful way, though, in comments on the videos I've been making so far, where people can get themselves stuck. There have been a lot of wonderful, all the comments have been wonderful, actually, literally, as I think about it right now. They've all contributed wonderfully to the discussion. Some people have felt like they've had like a breakthrough, and that's great. And then when people have felt stuck, if you look at it, it's going to be some form of, but how do I know this? Or how do I know this about the real world? And what I mean is, people are getting stuck by trying to like bite too much in one bite. I don't know how good a mental picture that is, but they kind of like wanting all or nothing, or too much or nothing. Or they want to know, how do I know this particular thing? Or can you give me an example? But their examples in their mind are kind of restricted to certain things they want, or certain problems they're trying to solve, or certain areas of life. And we need to sort of make maybe a mini paradigm shift, right? This isn't necessarily the entire shift I'm talking about. But in order to get past that issue, in order to get to the right answer and understand how to think without lenses, how to use our actual free will of ourselves as a conscious being rather than just our mind, which doesn't actually have free will, our mind. You need to have consciousness to have free will. But what you need to do to get there, to understanding your real free will, to understand how to think in a like a lensless way, is that you need to respect small steps, small footholds, small glimpses of what's correct, right? And that's absolutely critical. It's not small to respect these small steps. It's in one sense everything. Like, you really must do that, in my opinion, to get to the paradigm shift. And along those lines, as I've said already, and as I'll remind you, it's not the idea here in this video and in this series is not to be trying to be able to think without lenses all the time. Most of the time, nearly all of your time in life and all of your kind of thinking, decision making, and just living your life, you're going to be using lenses, perspectives, assumptions, just talking normally, thinking kind of normally, right? But you're going to be doing that using lenses that you've created or refined, or that you've done neither with, right? That are just your old lenses. You're going to be using that, some combination of refined lenses, created lenses, and just your old lenses in most of your daily life. But, and this is, an angle on everything, is you will have this new ability, which we can also call a meta ability, right? And an ability is a meta ability is like a subset of all your abilities, right? But anyhow, it's this, just to further kind of explain or describe is a better word. It's like a meta ability, but it's literally your free will and your only free will. But it changes the game completely. And this is why we want to spread this, right? Like, it will help you succeed in your normal earthly kind of short term, mid-term, whatever life. But this is the game. This is the real game. This is the real winning the game, is to get this for yourself and spread it to others. And that's what really matters and will really, and when I say it matters, like when I say it should be, to me, should, 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 and like strategy and morality, this will actually be on the next slide as one of the pieces, they actually collapse to the same thing. One of the beautiful things about making this paradigm shift and law of implication in general is we can let go of so much false, burdensome, distracting, confusing, misleading, success killing, quote unquote, morality. There's so many like things we feel like we should do, kind of like for no reason. There's this sort of moral overtone to so much of our decision making and our spending of money and our spending of time and what we focus on and how we feel. And so much of it is fake and false and wrong and pointless. And we can, and it's going to be a great benefit in our lives to be able to shed so much of that. And it has nothing to do with being amoral. It just has to do with shedding kind of false morality. And I don't just mean false moralizing or false judging others, but there's a whole set of kind of rules and boundaries that govern our behaviors that are just unhelpful, but we've just absorbed them from culture. Things we're not allowed to say, think, or things we should do or should spend our money or time on, and so forth. And you can have so many more resources in life if you are able to remove that from your life. So that's one of the benefits. But my overall point in the last few minutes, though, I made a number of useful points that I wanted to get to, but don't. So one is the small steps need to be treated as incredibly valuable, and small uses and small glimpses need to be treated as incredibly valuable. Small things that you can know. And then what I said after that was just repeating something. I know I repeated a number of times in this series, but it's critical. And that is not to think that I'm showing you how you're supposed to operate and think 24/7, because then you'll miss my point once again, because it's the only thing that's going to really block you if you're just listening to me here is this idea that, oh, that's not enough soon enough. Right? Even if you watch a video, right, and you're like, well, I don't think I got enough fast enough from that recording David did, right? That's really the only thing that's going to confuse, distract, discourage you, or mislead you into thinking you're not getting something when you are. Okay, so if you just do that, if you just value these kind of small, it's not like a small nugget. These aren't nuggets, but they're steps, they're building blocks. But to really value them. So raw lumber versus planks, I want to give you a mental picture here that maybe you'll just never unsee for the rest of your life. So what's one way to understand what's going on fundamentally in your life, in like your mental life, so to speak, your conscious life and so forth, but really like with your interaction with your mind, and your mind is not you. And if from what you've heard of me talk about in the past, I haven't explained that well enough, I'll cover more of that soon. But the one basic way to understand that you're not your mind is that something that changes is not the same thing. Your mind has to constantly change, make new associations, break old associations, process information, right? Gain new, when I say associations, memories, thoughts, whatever, learning. So your mind, your brain, and whatever else is part of goes on with your mind, By your mind, I don't mean your consciousness screen. I don't mean that which you are aware of. I mean the processing and the information storage and so forth that what you call your thinking, your memories, right? Your that sort of thing. The place where learning takes place and gets stored. That's your mind in my terminology. That changes. You cannot change, or else you would just no longer exist and be replaced by something different. So you have to be something that's inherently capable of unchanging, or inherently, therefore, is unchanging. I call that you as a being. Um, the qualities you have are things like awareness and free will, and by logical extension, a sort of responsibility for using that. Um, but your mind is not you. And so fundamentally what's going on in your existence, like kind of practically and fundamentally, is you're interacting with your mind. And something I realized early on in my journey, in my 20s, was that, see, your mind is not conscious and you are, but you guys kind of, the two of you, you and your mind, have this sort of Freaky Friday thing going on. I've never actually seen the movie Freaky Friday, and I think there's a sequel to it, but I think it's with Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan, and I believe there's a mother and daughter and they switch bodies, right? And so it's a good illustration for you and your mind in a certain sense, where there's this Freaky Friday thing going on where it's like you as a conscious being think that you're your mind because your mind is itself doing your thinking and perceiving for you, in essence. And so you're kind of seeing through your mind. So it feels like you literally are your mind. Kind of like another movie I haven't seen, but I believe in Avatar, there was like someone was in a sort of machine or suit or something, and maybe I think there was another machine or something or other that they were controlling. And if I'm wrong about that, it doesn't really matter because that's the illustration I want. So if the movie isn't that way, then I apologize. But if you're in this kind of machine or hookup that you're still in, you're controlling some kind of avatar that's separate from you, that's like this other robot or whatever, then you're kind of seeing through that robot's eyes, right? So while you're immersed in that, you kind of start to feel like you are that avatar or robot that you're controlling, right? Okay, so we have this going on with our mind. And what I'm saying here is a very profound building block that can help open up so much for you if you don't already have this. So you end up thinking that you are your mind. And your mind, weirdly enough, sort of thinks that it's you. Like your mind thinks that it's conscious, which it isn't. And you of course, it's not that you think you're unconscious, but you in essence behave as if you're unconscious unless you kind of realize this paradigm shift that I'm covering in this series. So people act as if they're unconscious, and minds kind of think that they are conscious because you're conscious. And so there's this weird switch going on. And learning to unravel that, which is a little bit weird at first or takes some practice, it's not complicated. It's in one sense a simple idea. There aren't complicated to me is like there's lots of moving parts or lots of parts, right? There's not a lot of parts here, but it's a weird shift. And kind of everything about how everyone else thinks around us and what we're used to thinking is different than that. And so whatever the word for that is, it shouldn't be complicated. The word shouldn't be complicated, but in a certain sense, it's difficult. You're overcoming the kind of way that everyone thinks and the way that you've thought, for your life typically. So in that way, it's an odd shift. And that's another angle on the basic shift that I'm talking about in this series, is learning to unravel that. And again, you're learning to unravel it just sometimes for a little while, and then you can create ideas, lenses, perspectives that you can carry forward. Or you can change certain ideas in your mind that you then carry forward as you live your normal life. But just keep reminding yourself whenever you kind of comes to your mind, like, oh, how am I supposed to always do this? Or how do I do that in this circumstance? I'm not saying that in every circumstance you need to use these right words or be thinking in this lensless way all the time. It's the same as when I talk to you guys. A lot of times you're going to quote unquote catch me talking, again, to say quote unquote normally. Like I'll say like, I'll say like, you'll learn this, right? And technically speaking, you as a being don't learn, your mind does. But I will talk in a normal way and say, you need to learn this, or it's good to learn this, or don't learn that, right? Or don't do this when I'm referring to something your body does. I will talk normally a lot of the time, right? Because I just can't, right? It's too clunky and hard to follow if I try to talk quote unquote correctly all the time. But it isn't correctly. It's just it's critical to be able to think and probably talk if necessary in a lensless way sometimes, right? And one could argue you can't. Can you really talk in a lensless way? Well, yes and no. It just kind of a little depends. But you can certainly build scenarios, talk about a scenario with somebody else, try to be careful, right? The words aren't going to be inherently perfect, but you can be kind of participating in an exercise either in your own mind alone or with somebody else in which you are trying to be lensless and talk amongst yourselves. And so it's a little bit like yes and no. And as I continue and get a little bit more in the weeds in other videos or whenever I do, we can examine some of the nuances there. There's a lot of like kind of details or nuances that if I stop constantly and try to address them, then it just gets kind of long and hard to follow the main thing I'm saying. So for this video, I want to give you this mental picture of the raw lumber versus planks. So when raw lumber is a little bit of a repetitive term, right? Lumber is kind of inherently raw, right? But I just use the word raw to make it very clear what I'm talking about is that in real life and also in plenty of there's a whole genres of games where you're kind of having people go out chopping wood, right? There's different like settlement building games or survival games. You're chopping wood from a tree, and then there might be a workstation, or in real life there's like a lumber mill, right? And you're turning the raw lumber, or just the lumber, right, into planks. So you have the raw material and the refined material. The refined material is the plank, the raw material is the lumber. So this metaphor has to do with your thoughts, but also your experience, like that which you're aware of, and conclusions, and basically any thoughts your mind gives to you. So your mind is constantly fabricating a sense of reality for you. This isn't bad, but it is bad. So okay, so let me think here. How do I say this? There is something bad about it. The bad is exactly this: agreeing with your mind that raw lumber is a plank. Okay, so that an unrefined thought or a conclusion presented to you by your mind as known or certain, or like a real in a certain way, in the sense of known or certain. So your mind presents things to you as certain and true and known that are not. Much like we could picture this in like a YouTube video by somebody styling themselves as an expert. And even if they are officially an expert because they have some sort of degree or something where it's not like they're lying when they say they're an expert. But, a lot of, being an expert and even before YouTube, right, when people are making info products, or I'm sure we can go back hundreds of years and you still have to present yourself as an expert, or thousands of years, right, for various reasons. So when someone's presenting themselves as an expert, then there's a certain kind of, whether they might believe it themselves, but there's a certain salesmanship or presentation to that, where the idea is that when you say something, it's authoritative, right? It's the final word, or at least authoritative. So there's this whole idea of authority that can sort of magically make something that's unknown into something that's known, right? Like if we're listening to an authority, the idea is by weight of them saying it, now we know it, right? But such a thing actually can't exist. Now, Christians and others and Christian leaders and so forth will tell us that, oh, we can't know about God unless God comes and tells us. Like we need to be told via authority what's true about God. Actually, the exact opposite is true. It's exactly false that you can ever, literally ever know something properly because of so-called authority. Authority is like a married bachelor in the way that it's used, right? Authority in the sense that there's either a legitimate, right? Authority is used kind of in two senses. One is that they legitimately can give you orders that you then should follow. Like they can just make something morally right or wrong by what they say that you're supposed to do. And then the other, which is actually logically related, is that they can make something known to you by saying it. But there's literally no such thing. Of course, God knows what's true. And of course, God could do what amounts to perfectly hypnotizing you into believing something that God says. And that thing that you're believing that God says could also or would also be true. Okay? So God knows what's true. And for people that are skeptical of God at this point, I'm not like assuming God is true here in the sense of trying to like prove that God's real by assuming. I'm just explaining from a certain I'm stipulating, but basically I'm doing what amounts to stipulating when I'm talking about God. But I'm only stipulating God's existence, something that I testify I can independently prove if you don't feel like I've done that already in previous videos. Um, but I'm not assuming God exists. I'm doing some combination of stipulating it and then in the past, and I've talked about at least how to know that it's true. Anyhow, let's not get hung up on that anymore than that disclaimer. So even stipulating that God exists, and once we do that, my understanding of God is that yes, God knows everything that's correct. So God knows all that actually is and cannot be deceived. But it's still the case that there's no possible way for God to tell us something in such a way that we know it's true. It certainly is possible. Now, someone could misunderstand what I'm saying, but to help them not do that, it is possible, again, for God to force us to believe something. Excuse me. It is also, but then God can't both kind of give us free will. Like knowing, in my understanding of the word, inherently has to involve free will. Of course, again, God can make you believe something and strip away your free will to question it in some way, right? But that wouldn't be knowing in my understanding of the word. Or my understanding of the concept. Of course, a word is just a sound or symbols that go with the concept. What else could God do? And God could certainly be, without stripping us of our free will, God could be extremely convincing, right? God could certainly create an extraordinary scenario in which you're seeing like God on, an image or some kind of image that inherently wouldn't be God. There's no image that can be God. But just like there's no image that can be even you as a being, right? But God could create an image that feels very awesome, sitting on some throne in some supernatural setting and do all sorts of stuff and then say something. And I certainly would act on that something unless maybe it involved violating other people. And then I don't even know. That gets kind of ridiculous. And so we'll figure that out. But I'd be really going over it in my head and being very hesitant and who knows, right? But certainly God could convince me with a great display of some such, right? But that's separate. That still wouldn't involve knowing, believe it or not. So I'm going on about authority here for a bit, but you can file that away and work on it yourself if you want. There's no such thing as like a proof that I can do to you either, as I've said before. I've explained that to some extent. You can work on it yourself, or I can explain it more in the future. But basically, we can't know something because of authority. So but the idea that I'm trying to really talk about here is that our mind is constantly presenting us raw material and saying it's a plank. And we, as like a zombie brainwashed sheep, if I'm being a little melodramatic to drive the point home here, just say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that is, right? Our mind is giving us conclusions, giving us a sense of reality and so forth. And and then when our mind just gives us certainty about that, right? And it might give us like some like evidence, like some things that seem to back it up. If we could check for a bit, and then we're like, yeah, okay, I know that. And in this video, I'm mostly going to introduce this, and then I'll continue in a future video. But let's see how I can wrap this up here a little bit. I know that I've kind of introduced mental images. I've talked about a number of things and I haven't probably seemingly explained what exactly lensless thinking is. I want to remind you again about something, which is this relates to even what I've been talking about since the beginning of the video. We want to stop. It's so seductive to feel like I want to get something. I want to feel like I know it, right? Instead of, if we can fill in a piece of what something is not sometimes, right? Again, if we picture a silhouette and we're filling in the part of the page that's not the silhouette until we see the silhouette of like a person, right? Or their profile of their face, right? I've filled in a number of things in this video that are very relevant pieces for lensless thinking. And I'll continue to do that, right? I'll with what I've said in this video, I'll be able to much more quickly maybe kind of finish up a description of lensless thinking and how it works in the next video. But there's a lot of things I've said here that kind of had to be said. So let me see if I can do any more justice to this raw lumber versus planks. What we want to do is get used to, and now when I say you need to learn this or get used to this, the getting used to it, the learning is going to be stored in your mind, right? You don't store things in your being, so to speak, but that happens, right? So what we want to understand and get used to the idea of starting to treat everything in our experience, really all our thoughts plus what we feel like is we're experiencing with our five senses, plus like the thoughts like in our head, whether it's words or images or feelings or whatever. We want to start treating all of those like lumber rather than planks, like a raw material rather than known conclusions. And that should include starting to spot all the different ways that our mind gives us conclusions. Even if we look at a computer and we have the thought, that's a computer. Instead of thinking, I know that's a computer, you want to start thinking that your mind is giving you like a raw material, like a piece of lumber, that's the conclusion that what you're looking at is a computer. The fact that you're treating it as lumber, as raw material, does not make it false, right? So you're not sitting around questioning your conclusions that your mind gives you. Remember, you don't even want to call them your conclusions anymore. You want to think of them as your mind's conclusions. So it's not about questioning assumptions, so to speak. It's not about questioning raw material. It's about identifying raw material as raw material, right? Like the bumper sticker question assumptions. Well, you don't really want to necessarily do that. Sorry, of course you want to question plenty of assumptions at times, but you can't like just go through your life questioning every assumption all the time, right? What you can do is understand that all the stuff that looks like planks in your life, that the stuff you know that you're sure of, that's real reality, all that, if you can start thinking of it all like raw material. Now, am I telling you to do that always? No. Just like I've been saying, just like, again, I'm glad I'm kind of going through this. This is for when you're stopping and thinking, when you're in that clean space. Now, this might happen for a few minutes throughout the day sometimes. It doesn't have to be like you're officially in front of your notebook, or officially doing a certain exercise. You might just be thinking about things and wondering whether, wait a second, is that really right? That might come up throughout your day too. And then for a little while, you might be thinking in this lensless way, or starting to think in this lensless way, even if you haven't so-called mastered it yet. But while you're attempting to think lenslessly, you want to treat all of the raw material, including things that look like planks, as raw. You want to treat everything as raw material until and unless you've refined it in some perfect way. And that would mean that the first thing you need to get straight is, well, how do I refine, right? How do I go about turning my raw material of my thoughts and experiences and what my sensory inputs and all that? How do I turn that into things I know? Right? What's that refining process? Because once you have that, you're off to the races, right? That's the paradigm shift, is to have it at all, like to have a beginning of it. But even to have the question about it and the determination and so forth to, yeah, okay, I have this idea where in a clean space, sometimes I'm going to treat everything like raw material starting with my method for refining in the first place, my method of knowing. Get that straight, turn that into a properly refined plank, the method itself, right? Like I want my lumber mill itself, my workshop, whatever, bench, workstation itself to be correct. I don't want that to just be something my mind gives to me, right? We start out in life with a starter and incorrect refining method, right? Way of knowing things. It's why people believe crap, because, it's so important to me, this idea of authority, why they believe crap like, oh, we can only know things from authority, or we can sometimes know things from authority. Or again, there's people and pastors that really preach fundamentally that the way to know truth is from authority. And that is deeply wrong, and it blocks people from what's right. It is as bad as possible. It is like it is one angle on the worst idea possible. The idea that you can know from authority, and the even more horrifying idea that you can only know from authority. Okay, that is a horrifying idea. As you, or if you've already made this shift I'm talking about in this series, you will see how and why it is so horrifying, because it prevents people from gaining real understanding, including of God, real knowledge, including of God. It sets people up, especially kids, but anybody, to be deconstructed. And a lot of the deconstructing of like the Bible and so forth is correct, because you're setting people up with, oh, because of authority, and then that can be deconstructed because it's false, right? If I teach my child that God is a married bachelor, then at some point someone might come by and show my child how there's no such thing as a married bachelor, and then my child, not my actual child, right, but just in theory, could then reject God. What you should do is reject the married bachelor part, not God, right? The fact that the Bible, saying the Bible is inerrant, or that we can only know or partially know from authority, the fact that that is false doesn't make the Bible false. It doesn't make God false. If I teach my son that God's a married bachelor, and then my son finds out that a married bachelor can't exist, it doesn't make God not exist. It just makes me wrong about God being a married bachelor. God's not wrong, I'm wrong. The married bachelor part's wrong, not God. Right? I'm not commenting on the Bible being wrong one way or the other. I'm just saying the Bible is not a married bachelor, and neither is God. Okay? When I talk about the Bible and inerrancy and rejecting that. Okay, well, I'll wrap up for now. I'm until and unless I'm constantly unsatisfied with how much I've explained, but I'm not going to beat myself up that I couldn't put 3 hours of explaining into half an hour or 40 minutes, and we will just continue. And hopefully people will still have breakthroughs from this, or that it will just be part of the breakthrough. They'll have stepping stones to breakthroughs, as happened in the previous video, and the video before that as well. Wonderful, guys. I appreciate you tremendously. Remember, if we're on YouTube, that we can help spread the word by doing YouTube things, commenting and such. Thanks, guys.